Miracles of Jesus last week, and today we're going to briefly just look at the next of the miracles. If you'd like to turn to John's Gospel, chapter 4, and there we've got verses 46 to 54. 46 to 54 of John's Gospel, chapter 4. It's headed, Jesus Heals a Government Official's Son. Once more, he visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned the water into wine. And there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son, who was close to death. Unless you people see miraculous signs and wonders, Jesus told him, you will never believe. But the royal official said, Sir, come down before my child dies. Jesus replied, you may go. Your son will live. This is the great bit. The man took Jesus at his word and departed. While he was on the way, his servants met him with the news that his boy was living. When he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said to him, the fever left him yesterday at the 7th hour. Then the father realized that this was the exact time at which Jesus had said to him, your son will live. So he and all his household believed. This was the second miraculous sign that Jesus performed, having come from Judea in Galilee. I don't want to spend long on this morning because we've got other things that are important to do too. But just to highlight some of the things that are in this miracle, or the way that this miracle all came together. And as was pointed out last week, there was a miracle in Cana. And Jesus went again to the same place to perform another miracle. Not only did he turn the water into wine, but he went further than that. And he gave them two to think about. So often when Jesus was in his ministry, he was travelling from place to place to place. And he would go to select areas, or to areas where he was led to go. Some areas he found very difficult because they were among his own people and they didn't understand him. Other areas were quite the opposite and people received him. But there was a significance in him going back to Cana. And we'll look at that a little bit later. But here we have a royal official, someone who was high up the standing within the authorities of the area. And we know from records in the Bible that Joseph got into a position of high standing. Joseph was a respected man who had authority. We know that David got up into a position of high standing, and that he was a man who ended up with a high authority. But here we've got a royal official, it says. He's only an official. He's not so much right up there, but he has authority. And I wonder what authority that man would have. Often, you know, the accounts in the Bible are only very brief, aren't they? About what they tell us about these people. And it leaves a fair bit to the imagination. Leaves a fair bit for us to sort out. But that's the great thing. Because we can find a way that it applies to us if we find an aspect within it which is appropriate to our need. And I wonder how important a man he felt, because it doesn't really come through in the passage, and yet it was obvious he had authority in the way he spoke. He'd been given authority over ordinary people. We don't know if he was a proud man, if he was a selfish man, if he was a pompous man, or if he was a humble man. But obviously he'd proved himself to the authorities that he was somebody special, to be in charge of some particular aspect. But he was also a family man, because he had a son and an heir. And this son lay desperately sick. In fact, it tells us that he was close to death. In fact, it relays to us that the life was draining out of this young man. I know that if anything bleeds to death, often I look at the blood as being the life within a person, because the blood carries stuff all over the body. It brings communication between head and limbs and digestive system and everywhere else in the body. And yet if once you drain the blood, that communication is lost and life drains away. Jesus knew what that was all about. And here was a young man who was draining away. And how unjust it seems when a young man of that stage of life is losing the very essence of life that should be very much vibrant and rejoicing like what we've done this morning. But where there is life, there is hope. As long as life exists, there is hope. And that's been a philosophy of my animal care at home. And sometimes you know fine well that there isn't a lot of hope. But as long as there's a heartbeat and the blood is circulating round, there is hope that life will get better. And this man, this royal official, had this tremendous hope that for his son, life could get better. His son was an heir. And a son was a very important part of a family. And I'm not just exactly sure what emphasis he would put on, but I don't know whether I've told you before, but when Susan and I were in Papua New Guinea, the son was the most precious person within a family. Sadly, a daughter didn't mean anything. Sadly, a daughter was someone that they could do without. And Susan went to a celebration of twins being born. And all the celebration was about the son. And where was this daughter? Outside. Left away. Their culture was that the son was the heir, the son was most precious, the son would be the warrior, the son would hunt for food, the son would protect the family. I don't know what they thought the daughter would do. Without the daughter there wouldn't have been a son, would there? But that's the way their culture existed. And I know that from the Bible that a young man was above a young woman in the values of family life. And there we have a place where there's no ambulance, no emergency response unit, nobody parked up as they are in the middle of Pickering just waiting to go when there's a need. No doctor at the end of a line. Only a mule. That could have been the express service, couldn't it, eh? Particularly if he was a stubborn old chap. And here was a chap who was 20 miles away from home, approximately. And 20 miles, how long would it take him to do 20 miles? At 4 miles an hour, he'd be pretty tired if he kept that up for 5 hours, wouldn't he? Particularly when the countryside wasn't all that smooth. If you look at some of the countryside in Israel and around, you know, it's a bit rugged. Not only is it rugged, but it's dry and dusty. And you need refreshment and shade on your journey. So in half a day, he'd be struggling to get there. Unless he was like the first one that ran the Olympic marathon. But Jesus said, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and all his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you." Now, just how much that official knew about those words, I don't know. Doesn't tell me. But I'm so pleased that he managed to pursue Jesus' teaching. Because as we find out, Jesus took him very seriously. But I do know that if we go back to verse 45, that's one verse before we begun. It says, "They had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, for they also had been there." And it could be that the royal official, had been there in Jerusalem beforehand and seen and experienced what Jesus could do, and that had spurred him on to seek the kingdom of God. And the lovely thing is, he found Jesus. He wasn't someone who was remote and unreachable. He was someone that, if he pursued the intensity of his search, he knew he would find him. And can you imagine him on his journey, how he would be going, and he would be probably listening to the noise of people rushing around as Jesus was moving in the middle. He'd probably be using his eyesight to the full on a high vantage point in order to be able to see where the centre of activity was. He would no doubt be meeting people on the way and talking to them and saying, "Have you seen Jesus? Do you know where he is? Has he been down this way? Do you know where he's gone? Anybody told you anything about him?" But he was searching diligently until he found him. He was eager because he had an urgent need. His son was close to death. And I couldn't help but think how God would feel when he realized the intensity of this man's search. How God would feel. God, who knows all about us, would know all about that same official. God would know how urgent it was in his heart. He would know how serious he was at finding Jesus. And he would know the faith of that man as to whether something positive would come out of his search. Because God too had a son. At one stage was very close to death. And then he did die. You see, God felt all the human emotions in caring for his son that you or I, or this royal official, would feel. There would be nothing that royal official would feel that God did not know about. He pleaded. He begged. There was nothing more important to him. And Jesus said, "Blessed are those who have faith without seeing." Blessed are those who have faith without seeing. And we don't know if this man had seen miracles performed something like this in Jerusalem. Jesus records 7 special miracles in John's Gospel for us. And they all have different dimensions, as you'll see from week to week. And I'm sure he did many, many more than those 7. But it's important that we grasp the aspect of each one as we go along. But the next bit is not really surprising. Jesus told him, unless you people see signs and wonders, you will never believe. Say that again. Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will never believe. In other words, he was challenging this young man or older man, whatever age he was. He was challenging him to be genuine 100% in what he believed. Was his faith 100% knowing that God would do it? Or did he have something inside that just wanted to see something which was beyond human explanation, but it didn't mean anything? And if we turn to Daniel chapter 4, we can see why. Because in Daniel, we find an account of Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar was a great king in his own way in Babylon. But he was a man who God used, surprisingly. And if we look at chapter 4 and we read the first verses, and this is after Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego had been in the hot fiery furnace. And they'd come out. They'd not had a singe mark on them. And yet that fiery furnace had been so hot that it had actually burnt to death a number of the centurions or the people that had actually taken them to that fire. But they were unharmed. And in chapter 4 we read, King Nebuchadnezzar, to the peoples, nations and men of every language who live in all the world, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs! How mighty are his wonders! His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. And then if you turn on to verse 28, and there we have an interpretation. Daniel has given an interpretation of a dream Nebuchadnezzar has had. Verse 33. When it got to verse 33, poor Nebuchadnezzar had forgotten that first bit he'd said in the beginning of chapter 4. And he'd looked over his kingdom, and he'd seen how great his kingdom was. And all this kingdom had been brought together because he had been a great ruler. But immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar in the dream was fulfilled. He was driven away from the people and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. In other words, he'd felt so high and mighty that he'd forgotten the God that he'd just been praising in the beginning of that chapter. The one who had great signs and wonders. The one who had an eternal kingdom and whose dominion endures from generation to generation. See, I believe that Jesus was just challenging this man because signs and wonders are brilliant. But I believe that signs and wonders are only part of the working of God. There's something that happens to substantiate what he does, but it's not the be-all and end-all of his ministry to each one of us. There are other things in the work of God within our lives than signs and wonders. And I believe that Jesus was challenging him because he wanted it to be more genuine than that. But then come the official's reply. It says, Sir. 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 He was an official. And the only person he would say sir to would be someone higher up than him. But immediately there was a recognition that Jesus had a lot more authority than he had. And he recognized that Jesus spoke with authority, and the authority with which he spoke was not on the same level. And he says, come, before he dies. You know, and he couldn't have just picked up his mobile phone and rung home and say, am I up to date with my information? Am I passing on something which is absolutely spot on? Or have things changed since yesterday when I left? Because it tells us it takes him a day to get back. So he didn't have immediate information. But he was working on what he knew. And that what he knew was enough for him at that time. And then Jesus replied, you may go. You may go. And I thought, what a polite way of putting it. Not a command. You could imagine Jesus saying, go, and he will be okay. But he didn't. He said, in the version I read, and I believe that the translation will be right, you may go. And thinking through that, he was still giving that opportunity of choice to the official. Still giving him the opportunity to believe Jesus or not. He didn't give him a firm command. You may go. As your heart feels, you may go. Wasn't harsh. He wasn't suspicious of the officer either. But like he gave the choice to Adam and Eve in the garden in the very early days, I believe he still gave the choice to this man to prove whether he had faith in what Jesus did. You may go. But then, the nice bit I like about this chapter, he took Jesus at his word. He believed in him. He had no doubt. He departed and went homeward. Again, to make that journey of 20 miles. But the miracle wasn't just for that man and his family. It wasn't just for that man and his son. The miracle was there for others to see as well. Because as he was on his journey, he was met by servants coming towards him who were excited. They had seen the miracle take place, but they'd not been with Jesus. They were quite removed from where Jesus was. But the presence of Jesus had been in that room. And with excited news, they told the official, your son is well. He's up, about. He's the young man that you want him to be. He's healed. And when the official paused, he said, what time did this happen? And they said it was in the 7th hour. Now, I don't believe that 7th was 7 o'clock in the morning. I believe that 7th hour was approximately, and I stand correction on this, just after lunch. Okay. So if the first hour of it begun about 6 o'clock with daylight approximately, it would be just after lunch or thereabouts. But you know, 7 is a significant number. 7 is a number of perfection. And there within the home of this official was the perfection. 7 is a number of reflection. And there within the home of this official was a position of reflection. Not just in the miracle itself, but of what God had done for this young man. 7 is a number of completion. And a number where the task within the life of this young man and within the faith of this official, it was completed. 7 is a number of fulfillment. And God worked his work within this family to fulfill in them the foundation of the faith which he gave them. So that was a significant time. What is a miracle? A miracle is something which is truly remarkable. A miracle is an extraordinary occurrence attributed to the spiritual. The dictionary tells us that bit too. A miracle is something that shows the mightiness, the sovereignty of the God whom we serve. A miracle is something which helps develop his kingdom, the kingdom of a living God. He gave life to this young man. And a miracle is something that proves that God is in touch. He's in touch with helping people. That God has a compassion. He doesn't just do miracles for pointless reasons. He does it because he believes that there will be fulfillment through the restoration of this young man. But a miracle is part of the entirety of God. A miracle is just not something on its own. It's part of the entirety of the teaching, of the learning, of the understanding, of the acceptance of who and what God really is. Some people can't take all that. I would invite you to take that this morning. In John's Gospel, chapter 6, it tells us of Jesus' disciples who could not take all that Jesus was teaching about. He could not take God, Jesus, in all his entirety. They could take so much of it, but the pain of it all was just too much. And so they stopped following Jesus. This morning I would invite you that when we look at the miracles, and there's 5 more to come, that we look at them in learning. We look at them in accepting. We look at them in discovering more and more of what God is all about. But to those who seek, they will find. To those who ask, the questions will be answered. And to those who knock, the door will be opened so that everything in God's kingdom will work together for his glory and his good. Can you rejoice this morning with that official when his son was restored? Praise God.